keen to produce an outstanding essay on Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility for your A-level examination, you're in the right place. This video will contain the most detailed insight on Dear Mrs Dashwood that you will find anywhere on YouTube. There'll be a series of activities for you to complete, and then I'll provide you with my detailed notes, insight and quotations. So, stay tuned and watch Schofield on Shakespeare. So, here's the first task to get you thinking in more detail about Dear Mrs Dashwood. Consider her role in the novel and write down 5 moments in what she does, says or thinks is important and or interesting. There's no need to use quotations, just summarise each moment in a single sentence using your own words. So press pause now, the video will resume in 5 seconds time. And here's my list, starting with Mrs Dashwood's disgust at the way Fanny arrives to take possession of Norland following the death of her late husband. Next, her boundless optimism when considering future housing options for herself and her 3 daughters. Next, she corrects Sir John's language as he speculates that Marianne may use every trick in the female book to ensnare an eligible husband. My 4th moment consists of a conversation between Mrs Dashwood and Eleanor. Both of them are worried about Marianne following Willoughby's horribly sudden departure. And finally, Mrs Dashwood is proactive when it comes to singing the praises of dull stick Colonel Brandon. Of course, he would be a perfect husband for her dear Marianne. Let's explore these moments in more detail, starting with Mrs Dashwood's rather imprudent, in a huff reaction to Fanny's admittedly insensitively early arrival to take the reins at Norland. Read through this passage now, pressing pause. It is certainly rude of Fanny to not even write a letter to Mrs Dashwood about her intentions of arriving at Norland. Legally, she is well within her rights to arrive at any point following Henry Dashwood's death, but good manners and propriety would suggest that she should at least go through the motions of sending formal condolences to the widow before suggesting a possible date for their arrival. So, to arrive, presumably the very day after the funeral or within the immediate mourning period, isn't great, and gives an early indication that this is a ruthless, self-centred, grasping soul. Nonetheless, given her newly impoverished financial situation and heavy responsibilities, not just to herself, but 3 dependent daughters, Mrs Dashwood's reaction to this rude upstartness is imprudent and reckless. Note the strength of the verb despise, a very strong dislike, very strongly looking down upon, which firmly positions her on the side of her middle daughter in terms of a propensity to react according to feelings, sensibilities, rather than sense. Quite frankly, she cannot afford to despise Fanny. And whilst that doesn't mean she has to fawn and flatter, Lucy Steele-esque, there is a middle ground which Eleanor shows can allow you to maintain your own self-respect. Dramatically storming out of the house forever with nowhere to go would be, to be blunt, stupid. So, Mrs Dashwood can react impulsively based on emotions, rather than thinking things through calmly and coolly like her eldest daughter. And this makes her a far less effective parent, in spite of, or perhaps because of the fact that she loves her daughters dearly. When Nora Bartlett says within her essay on mothers and daughters in Jane Austen that Mrs Dashwood doesn't seem to have the word caution in her vocabulary, She could easily have been referring to this near calamitous moment. On to my next moment now. Mrs. Dashwood has managed to stick it out within the luxurious surroundings of Norland, Fanny notwithstanding. But of course they need to find their own Fanny-free place to live. Read through this extract from chapter 3 and press pause. Once again, there are clear signs of Mrs. Dashwood's sensibilities, her inclination to be unhelpfully dictated to by emotions. Her ability to think and plan strategically for the future is blunted by her wallowing. At times she simply sits and feels sorry for herself, indulging in melancholy remembrances which only makes her feel worse. But perhaps this is to be expected to some extent from someone who has lost a partner, and unusually for the novel, a partner whom she passionately loved and was well suited to, judging by her comments to Marianne later in the same chapter. But when not depressed, Mrs. Dashwood does partake in some planning and parenting. Note that her inquiries about an appropriate house for them are indefatigable, are tireless. While this apparent persistence is to be applauded, it is clear that Mrs. Dashwood has no acute financial sense. The fact that she would settle upon a house beyond their means is worrying. Without Elinor's steadier judgments, short-term ease and relief could potentially be followed by longer-term social disgrace and deprivation. But when we consider the context of the time, is it such a surprise that women can be ill-equipped to deal with the practical realities of life following the loss of an important male figure? Look at the paucity of education for women at the time, as summarised by Maggie Lane within Jane Austen's world. Female education, beyond providing a woman with accomplishments that could help her attract a partner, was not considered remotely important. It was much more limited, ad hoc, generally women passing on ignorance to other women. Within this context, the wonder is not so much that Mrs. Dashwood has no grasp of numbers, but that Elinor somehow does. Note also Mrs. Dashwood's naivety and her complete lack of doubt that her stepson John will follow through on his promise to her late husband and support them appropriately. This is simply wish fulfillment, rather than based on an acute knowledge of either her stepson or his grasping wife. For her, it is unthinkable, sacrosanct for a deathbed promise to be effectively rescinded. Yet, with no formal agreement in place, she has no concept that human nature and greed can combine to reinterpret past history in an unfavourable way to herself and her daughters. In rejoicing for the sake of John's heart, she is wilfully ignoring what she knows about his character in an orgy of impotent wish fulfillment. What about this figure of £7,000, the lump sum settled on her following the death of her husband? Is she right to be persuaded that a much smaller figure than this would support her in affluence? This £7,000 would result in an income of £350 per year, using the 5% calculation given by Edward Copeland within his chapter on money from the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen. Mrs. Dashwood reckons that she could still support an affluent lifestyle with a much smaller amount of money than £350. Well, here's what £300 a year could get you. What we're seeing here is naivety and wishful thinking. Yes, Mrs. Dashwood would be able to continue living within genteel circles on this figure, but only just. Affluence is the state of having a lot of money or owning many things. This would emphatically not be the case for Mrs. Dashwood here. Now for the third moment, and Mrs. Dashwood is indignant, good-humouredly indignant. In this extract, Sir John is attempting to banter with Marianne. She has asked him to give details about handsome new stranger Willoughby. He has replied, but has now shifted the subject matter to praise Colonel Brandon. Read through this extract now, pressing pause. We see another side to Mrs Dashwood here. We see genuine, helpful, proactive parenting. Sir John is, of course, aiming his comments at Marianne. Mrs Dashwood knows that her daughter is likely to be highly irritated and indignant at what she sees as Sir John's presumption and impropriety in teasing her about her future matrimonial options, and so she speaks on behalf of her daughter. And she does so in a polite, good-humoured way. Yes, she rebukes Sir John for the implication behind the verb catching, that her daughters would be prepared to use clever stratagems in order to entrap and ensnare an eligible husband, yet she does so in a gentle, restrained way. Her language is particularly formal, as seen in the use of incommoded, meaning inconvenienced in this context, and employment. And this reinforces the appropriate distance between her family and Sir John's. She wants to show that, in spite of their relative poverty and coming down in the world, her family knows how to behave within genteel society, and they'll never stoop below their own standards, even to secure an eligible match, something so critical for their collective futures. But her tone remains light-hearted. She knows the importance of not offending bluff, good-hearted Sir John. To be fair, he's not the most sensitive of souls, and would actually be very difficult to offend. Yet her pride and integrity demand that she cannot allow her daughters' matrimonial hopes to be speculated about so freely within their daily exchanges with the Middletons. So, in this conversation, Mrs Dashwood does the right thing and uses her experience with social situations to speak on behalf of her daughter and set the record straight about her family. Her daughters have been properly brought up. But Mrs Dashwood doesn't always do the right thing. In this extract, we jump to chapter 16. Willoughby has mysteriously and abruptly left Devonshire, leaving Marianne distraught. Eleanor and Mrs Dashwood have no real idea about the exact status of Marianne and Willoughby's relationship. Their past actions might seem to indicate that they are engaged, but this hasn't been confirmed by either party. Read through this extract now and press pause. Mrs Dashwood's first two sentences are revealing. After refusing to ask Marianne directly whether she is engaged, she gives a first reason that it would cause a great deal of distress if it were to turn out that she wasn't. For me, this entirely misses the point. If Marianne isn't engaged, then her behaviour towards Willoughby has repeatedly flouted the rules of propriety, and thus it is her duty as a parent to educate and reprimand. Mrs Dashwood is 16-year-old Marianne's sole surviving parent. If she isn't prepared to offer guidance and bring up awkward topics of conversation, then who will be? As confirmed within Maggie Lane's Jane Austen's world, Marianne and Willoughby break 5 types of rules relating to appropriate behaviour between men and women. Yet, what does her mother do about it? She tells the older sister that she couldn't possibly get involved in case it upsets her. She sounds far more like a teenage friend, teenage bestie, than a mother. She runs such risks by asking Marianne about her relationship with Willoughby, her daughter might never decide to confide in her again. Once again, Nora Bartlett's phrase is apt. By being far more like a friend than a mother, Mrs Dashwood ultimately increases Marianne's angst and contributes to her later breakdown. If she had insisted on Marianne following the rules of propriety, Marianne would not have been able to spend so much intense time alone with Willoughby. She might still have fallen in love with him, but she would have been forced to maintain some sense of perspective. And by refusing to question Marianne here, her middle daughter is left to daydream, yearn impotently, and live solely within her own fantasy world. She may not have wanted to listen to any advice or words of caution from others, what teenagers do, but over time she is likely to have been forced to become slightly more realistic and rational about the future. For me, Mrs Dashwood's behaviour is lazy, cheap parenting and negligence. In Volume 3, following Marianne's slow recuperation from her life-threatening illness, Mrs Dashwood becomes an enthusiastic supporter of a match between her middle daughter and Colonel Brandon. Never mind that the former was previously creeped out by the enormous age gap between them and the fact he is old enough to be her father. Read through this extract now, pressing pause. Here we see a return to something like competent parenting. Mrs Dashwood is right to point to Colonel Brandon's constancy, which implicitly contrasts favourably with the impression we get from Willoughby of impulsivity and flightiness. She is also prudent to recognise that, in one way at least, Willoughby might have been a more attractive proposition, and in doing so she shows the potential to reason, argue and convince, which may well be needed in this case. By promoting this match, Mrs Dashwood is showing her love for her daughter in a positive, more active way. Whatever his appearance, there is no doubt that Colonel Brandon is not just kind and principled, but also has loved Marianne constantly and devotedly for the majority of the time period of the novel. However, amusingly, we see Mrs Dashwood, albeit harmlessly, rewriting history in her claim that Willoughby had a certain look about him that she didn't quite trust. If this had really been the case, then her words to him after learning of his need to depart Devonshire at once would surely have been far less effusive. To conclude, here we see Mrs Dashwood wanting to wipe out past unhappiness by convincing herself that actually Willoughby wasn't quite as nice as they had all thought at the time. She allows herself to move on in a practical, sensible way. There must be no past regrets now that such a potentially eligible match is within her faded middle daughter's grasps. Let's move on. In the exam, you will need to wheel out actual quotations giving very specific individual insights. So it's time for your second task. Reread sections of the novel before writing out 5 quotations which give different insight into what Mrs Dashwood is really like. In order to ensure that you are revising as many different sections of the novel as possible, avoid quotations or sections of the text which have been discussed so far within this video. Press pause now to get started. Here's my first quotation. The Dashwoods have arrived at Barton Cottage and, understandably, have mixed feelings about it, particularly after living somewhere as large and luxurious as Norland. Mrs Dashwood ruminates, perhaps in the spring, if I have plenty of money, as I dare say I shall, we may think about building. What I like here is the breezy way Mrs Dashwood says that she dare says she'll have plenty of money in the spring. Actually, no she won't. Her stepson, in spite of his promise to her husband, has given her absolutely nothing, which means that she and her daughters have to live on £500 a year. Will there be much left from this amount? You make your own mind up. Overall, this quotation does show an attractive, optimistic side to Mrs Dashwood, but would you really want this sunny person in charge of your household expenditure? Austen's subsequent ironic summary of the situation directs the reader appropriately. The notion of being able to think about building in the spring is ludicrous. In my second quotation, we see Mrs Dashwood's reaction to Eleanor and Edward's growing intimacy at Norland's. We learn, no sooner did she perceive any symptom of love in his behaviour to Eleanor than she considered their serious attachment as certain and looked forward to their marriage as rapidly approaching. In my previous quotation, we saw Mrs Dashwood's naivety in thinking that money would just magically materialise to help them improve Barton Cottage. And we see naivety here too. The total confidence in a future marriage, as shown by the adjective certain and the adverb rapidly, shows an extraordinary lack of understanding of just how complicated securing eligible marriages can be, particularly when there is a financial disparity between the two. Eleanor and Edward may well be from the same social plane. Even Fanny must accept this, given that she is married to Eleanor's brother. But there are so many potential hazards along the way. Most notably in this instance, there is the fact that, as Eleanor points out in the next chapter, he is very far from being independent. What his mother really is, we cannot know. As a mother, you would expect Mrs Dashwood to have the best idea about the potential mishaps and pitfall when it comes to the world of marriage. But no. In her breezy, optimistic, stupid outlook, you love, therefore you marry. But Austen's world emphatically doesn't work like that. This kind of ignorant attitude ultimately results in the Dashwood children largely having to parent themselves. In my third quotation, a more positive side to Mrs Dashwood. The opportunity to live at Barton College has most fortuitously turned up, and Mrs Dashwood wants to get on with it. She waited only for the disposal of her effects at Norland's and to determine her future household before she set off for the West, and this, as she was exceedingly rapid in the performance of everything that interested her, was soon done. So actually, Mrs Dashwood can be a woman of action. She can be exceedingly rapid to act when she makes up her mind to do so, which in some ways is a surprising description of a woman who has been wallowing around Norland for several months without seemingly doing a great deal. But, as ever with Austen, the key is in the detail. She is only exceedingly rapid when genuinely interested in a task, which of course implies that when something is boring or irritating, she may prefer to ignore it rather than act decisively in the interests of her own family. And this is the contrast between Mrs Dashwood and Marianne and Eleanor. Whereas Eleanor will act according to the rules of propriety, Marianne and Mrs Dashwood will act to some extent to how they're feeling at the time. That might be fine for matriarchs like Mrs Ferrers or Lady Catherine de Bourgh from Pride and Prejudice, but not for those with a combined income of just £500 a year. In my fourth quotation, Mrs Dashwood has rather belatedly arrived at Cleveland to look after Marianne. Eleanor is a bit worried that Mrs Dashwood might keep Marianne awake, having not seen her for so long, and thus deprive her of much-needed rest. But actually, Mrs Dashwood could be calm, could be even prudent, when the life of a child was at stake. She has the presence of mind, the instinct of a mother, to know that nothing matters more than facilitating her daughter's recovery. She knows instinctively that her own desire to communicate and console has to become secondary to allowing Marianne to rest. She knows that she must restrain her own alarm. Appearing to be lovingly composed in front of Marianne is the surest way to help her get better. Yet once again the small details are revealing. The adverb even reminds the reader mindful of her laxity in relation to Marianne and Willoughby, and mindful of the way she nearly stormed out of Norland faced with Fanny's insolence, that being prudent, being careful and avoiding risks is relatively unusual for this most loving yet incompetent of parents. My final quotation is an interesting one. Now promoting the relationship between Marianne and Colonel Brandon, Mrs Dashwood confides in Eleanor. I'm very sure myself that had Willoughby turned out as really amiable as he has proved himself the contrary, Marianne would yet never have been so happy with him as she will be with Colonel Brandon. Is this likely to be true, or is it continued wish fulfillment? Well, Eleanor disagrees, or at least can't fully agree with her mother, and in this novel she is normally on point. Marianne and Willoughby's connection and genuine passion for each other seem particularly unusual within Austen's world. In today's world, sharing common interests and passions, and yes, a sexual spark, is seen as a great starting point for a successful long-term relationship. Why shouldn't it be the case here for Willoughby and Marianne? But we mustn't take Mrs Dashwood's words out of the context of the time. With women so dependent on men for their financial and social security, there is an argument that having someone so cast-ironly reliable as Colonel Brandon with his solid £2,000 a year as a husband is likely to result in greater constancy of happiness for Marianne. There may not be the ecstatic highs, with presumably the dizzying lows of a glamorous Marianne-Willoughby union, but the relationship will remain far more on an even keel. With stability comes peace of mind, and with peace of mind you are more likely to feel content.
It looks like we've come to the end of this video exploring character within Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. I hope it's been useful. Many thanks for watching.